to the Majority Report. I'm Michael Brooks. Joining us now is Christy Thornton. She is an assistant research professor at Johns Hopkins University. Christy, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, Christy, you focus on Mexican politics and the relationship between the United States and Mexico and all the sort of variables that includes. And obviously, I think in the popular mind, Mexico has sort of been at the forefront essentially because of the xenophobia that has, propelled Trump to the White House in many respects and influenced his, governance such as it is. That's sort of in the broader kind of popular mind. There's definitely a tabloid culture around Mexico. You have Breitbart, which not only talks about immigration, but also in some ways, they're giving you a ongoing sort of tabloid version of Narcos right now in real time with a very sensationalistic coverage of the drug war, which also sort of fuels a lot of this anxiety that we see influencing our politics. But I would just, hoping if you could just step back a little bit from that and explain what's happening politically on the other side of the border, to use that, often used phrase, because some of the same dynamics that are infecting politics globally, which is that people are really finally getting fed up with elites, specifically economic ones, and the sort of failures of neoliberalism are very pronounced in Mexico. And maybe through that, we can also start to realize the ways in which even these problems that we like to demonize Mexico over are really, they're still centered in the United States, whether it's drug war policy or economic conditions that, lead to, the types of challenges that demagogues exploit.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. We saw Trump make Mexico a real focus of his campaign literally on day one. When he announced his candidacy, right, he did so by demonizing Mexicans. And so many in Mexico were really surprised, frankly, to be made the center of a U.S. presidential campaign in that way. And so that has had some interesting dynamics in Mexico. You're very much right that there is a sense of being fed up with politics as usual, being fed up with neoliberal economics, being fed up with the very corrupt government that has ruled Mexico for so long in that country. And so you saw the current president, Enrique Peña Nieto, has gotten some kudos recently for being able to kind of stand up to Trump a little bit. That's really interesting because he is a wildly, wildly unpopular president in that country. A few months ago, an opinion poll came out that put his approval rating at 12%. So he has overseen a series of scandals, from corruption scandals implicating himself and his family, his government, the forced disappearance of those 43 college students that happened in 2014.
Would you explain that just a moment?
Go ahead.
No. Would you just, because we covered this on the show a bit, but maybe just remind people of that student disappearance story, if you could take a minute on that and then keep going.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a really important part of what's going on in Mexico now. And one of the really crucial things that served to delegitimize the current government, the government of Enrique Peña Nieto. So in 2014, your listeners will remember that there was this case where a group of students from a teaching college in southern Mexico had attempted to basically commandeer some buses to take them to a protest. They were stopped by local police, some military forces, and 43 of them were disappeared. 6 people were killed that night, and the 43 who were disappeared were all young teaching college students, none of whom has ever been seen again. The remains, fragmentary bone remains of one, have been found under kind of suspicious circumstances. And what happened in the aftermath of that was not only a kind of shock and outrage at this happening, but even more so shock and outrage at the government's response to it, which was to delay, to confuse, and to deny. And so the government came out with what they called an official story of what they thought happened, what they called the official truth, the historical truth. And that was very quickly proven, almost every aspect of it, to be a lie. And so that has really served to massively delegitimize the government in Mexico. And that's on top of a number of other, not only human rights abuses type scandals, but political and economic scandals related to the federal government. And so this is the context in which the president has a 12% approval rating. People are incredibly fed up. I lived in Mexico from 2012 to 2013, and you just saw people out on the streets constantly. On the day that Peña Nieto was elected, there was a massive protest in Mexico City. He had to be inaugurated behind these huge barricades and rows of riot police because so many people were opposed to his presidency from day one. And so you're very much seeing a rejection of this politics as usual. Trump coming in kind of throws a wrench in how that has worked, and I think is creating some really interesting moments for Mexican politics and for the U.S.-Mexican relationship.
Absolutely. So tell us where Peña Nieto comes from. Like, want to get like these sort of, because there's these broader understandings for all of these forces, right? There's everything from, the United States relationship, actually, even in some cases, we'll get to it later, the DEA and a specific cartel in Mexico. There's the, role of the sort of shift of centers of drug production going from Colombia to Mexico and how those relationships kind of affect state capture with cartels. And then there was also NAFTA opening up the drug market in the United States. But, when you talk about Peña Nieto, he represents a party that has governed Mexico almost continuously since the 1920s. Maybe you can give us the political map of Mexico. Who are the different players? Where does Peña Nieto come from? Is there opposition from the right? Is he the right? Is there opposition from the left? What set this sort of broader table for where he comes from?
That's a great question. So politics in Mexico can be a little bit confusing because Mexico was a one-party state, basically from the late 20s up until 2000, when we had the kind of culmination of what people in Mexico called the democratic opening, the first time that other parties, besides Peña Nieto's party, which is called the Institutional Revolutionary Party, known as the PRI. So the first time that the PRI lost the presidency in its entire history was in 2000. That was in the culmination of there had been some regional, sort of gubernatorial and legislative victories by other parties. They finally lose the presidency for the first time in 2000. It turns over to an opposition party. That opposition party was the long-standing conservative kind of center-right business party called the National Action Party, the PAN. And Vicente Fox, who has been one of these most vocal Mexican critics of Donald Trump, was the president who took over. He was a kind of bombastic, swaggering cowboy. He's from the north of Mexico. The party is really centered in Monterrey, which is a northern industrial city, had long been there. And so the kind of right-wing business class was really focused on this party. And so that opposition party, the right-wing party, the PAN, ran Mexico for 12 years. There were two, what we call sexenios, the two presidential terms. Vicente Fox was in power for 6 years, and he was then succeeded in the election in 2006 by Felipe Calderón. And Calderón was the person who really inaugurated the drug war as we know it in Mexico, what he called the war on drugs and organized crime. And so we had this 12-year interregnum between the PRI having been in power for 70 years, then 12 years of rule by the center-right business party, and then Peña Nieto came back to power. And he came back to power for a number of reasons. It's important to remember that he won. There isn't a second round of voting in Mexico. So he won with not a majority, but a plurality. He got 38% of the vote. And a lot of what the voters who voted for him said was that they were tired of the insecurity and instability that had come with Calderón's drug war. And so the massive increases in militarization and the massive increase in violence and murder that attended that after Calderón started his war on drugs in 2008 really scared a lot of Mexicans. And so some percentage of them decided that things were better. They were more stable back under the PRI, under this party that had run Mexico as a single-party state for 70 years. So they brought Peña Nieto back to power. He was supposed to be the kind of boy savior of Mexico. He's very sort of classically attractive, very well coiffed. He went to all of the right schools. He wasn't known as being an intellectual. During the campaign, they asked him to name his 3 favorite books, and he could only come up with one. But he had this idea that he was supposed to turn Mexico around. Everyone was talking about the drug war and the violence. he wanted to, as he put it when he appeared on the cover of Time magazine, change the narrative about their narco-stained nation. And so that was really his push. He said, we want people to talk about what's going on in Mexico differently. And the reason that he wanted that was because he wanted foreign investment to come back to Mexico.
Right.
The instability and insecurity of the drug war had meant that U.S. companies were starting to say, we don't know if it's safe to invest. And so he had this idea that if he could turn around what people thought about Mexico, then he might be able to kind of turn the corner. Now, he didn't really change any of the policies with regard to the drug war. He did try to put in place a whole series of deepening of the neoliberal economic reforms that had been started the previous 20 years.
Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos